They say if you press your ear to the river stone behind Whitaker Mill on a moonless night, you'll hear the names of the dead, not whispered, but wept. You weren't supposed to hear that. No one was. The people of Ashevale don't speak of the mill anymore, not aloud, not even in passing. They walk a little faster past the old foundation where the wheel once turned, and every child is taught the same lesson before they can even read. Never go near the water after dark. But that rule came too late, because by the time the town realized what the Whitaker brothers had done, it had already soaked into the land. It's easy to forget how strange 1862 really was. While the country bled itself dry in civil war, little towns like Ashevale just tried to survive, farm, pray, marry. But something happened that year, something the town has buried deeper than any soldier. It began with a sound, not a scream, not a crash, but something much worse. A low moan from the river itself. The first to hear it was Silas Haynes, the cooper's son. He told his mother he heard voices calling from under the mill wheel. She slapped him hard and told him never to say such things again. That same night, Silas disappeared. 3 days later, his boots washed ashore, tied neatly together. The Whitaker Mill stood at the center of everything, a towering structure of blackened timber and iron gears, thrumming with power long after midnight. Even when no one was inside, they said it never stopped, that its wheel turned even when the river froze solid, and the brothers, they said even less than the stones they walked on. Elias and Corwin Whitaker were respected, feared, yes, but respected. But what no one knew then was this. They weren't milling grain anymore. They were feeding something older, and it was beginning to whisper back. They built the Whitaker Mill too close to the gorge. Everyone said so at the time, but the brothers insisted. The current is stronger here, Elias told the town elders, more reliable. It will turn the wheel even in dry seasons. But strength comes at a cost, and what ran beneath that mill was not just water. It was something ancient, something hungry. The foundation was laid in the fall of 1858, but by spring, strange things had already begun. Tools went missing. Workers reported hearing soft tapping sounds inside the timbers at night, rhythmic, like breathing, and one man, Joseph Deeks, a carpenter from Montpelier, went mad after spending 3 days inside the wheelhouse. He walked into the river fully clothed and never came up. The coroner listed it as suicide, but his body was never found. Corwin said nothing, just replaced him with another man. Same wage, same fate. By 1862, the mill was running day and night even when there was no grain to grind. Locals joked it must be chewing its own teeth. But there was no laughter in their eyes. You see, something changed that winter. People began hearing things. A low groan echoing off the gorge, a grinding beneath the earth, children waking from sleep with bleeding noses and whispers in their ears, voices that didn't speak English or any language known to man. And always, the wheel turning. The Whitaker brothers, once humble and withdrawn, became distant and stern. They attended no church, answered no visitors, and began hiring workers no one recognized, men who didn't speak, men who didn't stay in town. One night, old Margaret Harrow, the midwife, saw something that turned her hair white. She said she looked down from the ridge at midnight, and the wheel was spinning in the wrong direction, upstream. That's when the dreams started. The whole town began suffering from the same night terror, choking, drowning, heavy footsteps behind their doors, and the sound of grinding bones. The town doctor wrote to Boston for help. He never received a reply. The letter was found in the roots of a dead tree, a mile from his house, folded like a prayer. This wasn't just machinery, this was ritual, and the Whitaker Mill was the altar. There were 13 beams in the grinding room, 12 were visible. The 13th, no one ever spoke of it aloud, but everyone who worked there felt it. It ran vertically, deeper than the others, black as coal, warm to the touch even in mid-January. Elias Whitaker called it the support, but the workers called it the bone. They swore it pulsed. When the moon was full, it hummed. One man, Thomas Ward, a millwright from New Hampshire, drove a nail into it. A week later, he was found suspended by iron hooks above the hopper chute, ribs cracked open like a cabinet door. No one reported it. No funeral was held. His name was simply removed from the ledgers, as if he'd never been hired. That was the first rule at Whitaker Mill. You don't ask questions. The second, never look in the grain chute after midnight, because sometimes what spilled down wasn't corn or wheat. Sometimes it was red. But Corwin, he never flinched. He kept the accounts balanced, kept the payroll on time. Elias tuned the machines like a symphony of blades and stone. They ran the mill like a church, and the sound it made wasn't work. It was worship. You have to understand something about men like the Whitakers. They weren't possessed. They weren't cursed. They were loyal to something older than God. Something that had lived in the cracks of the world long before names. Something that fed not on flesh but on silence, obedience, and fear. The kind of entity that doesn't need blood unless it's disobedient. In April of 1862, every clock in Asheville stopped at 3:17 a.m., not once, not twice, every night for 13 nights in a row, and every morning after, someone in town was missing. By the end of the 13th night, there were 13 empty beds, no signs of struggle, just piles of clothes folded neatly, and at each scene, a handful of flour, not store flour. This was pale, doctor, and gritty, with something black mixed in, something like ash, something like ground bone. But the mill kept turning, and Asheville kept silent, until one boy disobeyed, and what he saw in that mill nearly tore his mind in half. His name was Jonah Mears, 12 years old, curious, disobedient, and marked. Though he didn't know it yet, Jonah's father hauled lumber to the Whitaker Mill twice a week. Strict man, kept his son in line with leather and scripture. But one night the old man came home pale, shaking, hands raw with rope burns. He never said why. 3 days later he vanished, left his boots by the door, coat on the hook, and was never seen again. Jonah waited for 2 days before deciding to find out for himself. It was just past midnight when he crept from the house, the lantern low, the fog thick. He crossed the pasture in silence, boots muffled in damp earth, until the mill came into view, that black silhouette hunched over the river like a thing waiting to strike. The wheel was turning. Of course it was. But there was no grain, no wagons, no workers. And yet, something was being processed. Jonah slipped inside through the side entrance, the one his father used, and made his way down to the grinding room. The air was warm, heavy, like a mouth breathing. And then he saw it. The grain chute was open, but it wasn't flour spilling out. It was hair. Human, long, dark, matted with something wet. Jonah backed away slowly, but his boot struck metal. A bell rang. Not one made of brass or steel. This sound wasn't heard. It was felt. The whole mill stopped. Even the wheel, even the river. Then came the footsteps. From the rafters above, from beneath the floorboards, from inside the walls. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. And then, Elias Whitaker's voice, echoing through the dark. Who walks against the wheel? Jonah ran, blind, stumbling, gasping through dust and dark. He burst from the mill into the fog, lungs full of flour and fear. But something followed. It didn't chase him. It just watched. And as Jonah crossed the creek, he heard the whisper, clear as a bell, just behind his left ear. Your blood remembers. He collapsed on his porch before dawn. They found him hours later, half-conscious, eyes bloodshot, whispering one word over and over. Bone. Asheville was founded in 1791. But the land was already owned. Not by man, not by law, but by something beneath. The Mohegan tribes refused to hunt near Copper Gorge. They said the water there ran both ways, that it spoke during eclipses. When settlers ignored their warnings and built anyway, the first sawmill burned to the ground during construction. No fire, no lightning, just smoke rising from the stones. 3 men died that day. Their names are lost, but their bones are not. Elias Whitaker knew all of this, because he studied the land deeds himself and found what no one else had ever read, the original map. Not the one filed in Montpelier, but the one scratched into calfskin, bound in pitch, and hidden in the floorboards of the old town hall. It didn't mark the river. It marked veins, lines beneath the soil, ancient tracks of pressure and presence, intersecting at one precise point, where the Whitaker mill now stood. Elias called it the mouth. He believed the grinding stone wasn't meant for wheat or corn. It was meant to open. He told Corwin late one night over brandy and candlelight, "Grain is just ritual. What it wants is memory. Blood contains more than history, brother. It contains direction." Corwin didn't believe him at first. But then came the drought. The river dried up for 6 weeks. Every other mill shut down, except theirs. The wheel kept turning. No water, no rain, just movement, grinding, feeding. And during that dry spell, the dreams came harder. People woke screaming, hands clenched, eyes wide. Infants died in their sleep, milk curdled in the pail, and 3 more townsfolk vanished, including the sheriff. No one dared investigate, because by then, even the skeptics had begun to feel it. The pull, the slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat in the earth, and always, always the whisper from the mill at night, "Turn woo, with us, or break beneath us." Asheville was no longer a town, it was a mouthpiece, and the Whitakers were no longer men. They were stewards, caretakers of an old, buried hunger, and it was getting ready to open. In the attic of the Whitaker house was a locked trunk. Heavy, iron-bound, laced with wire that hummed when touched. No one in town had ever seen it moved. No one but Corwin and Elias even knew it existed. But what sat inside that trunk wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, it was something far more powerful. The harvest ledger, handwritten, bound in human hide, each page marked with a name, a weight, and a symbol. Not English, not Latin, something pre-alphabetic, circular, layered like something a machine might dream. Jonah Mears, after his escape, spoke of the ledger only once. He said it was alive, that its pages twitched, that the ink inside it moved when you tried to read it. And worst of all, he said his mother's name was on the final page. She hadn't even died yet, but 2 days later she drowned in her own well, though the bucket rope was still dry. You have to understand what the ledger meant. It wasn't a record, it was an agreement. Elias Whitaker believed the mill was more than industry. It was ritual made mechanical, a contract, renewed by action. As long as the wheel turned, as long as names were written and fed to the stones, the town would prosper. And for a time, it did. Bountiful harvests, quiet winters, no disease. But every gain came with a price, 1 name per season, written in the book, given to the mill. But in 1862, something changed. The entity, the one in the gorge beneath the wheel, began demanding more. Not just a name, not just a body, but a lineage. Something had awakened under the foundation, something Elias called the mouth of return, and it didn't want strangers anymore. It wanted bloodlines. That's why the disappearances stopped being random. That's why the mill turned faster, louder, hotter. That's why Jonah Mears, 12 years old, broken by what he saw, woke up one night with his own name carved into the wood above his bed, in his mother's handwriting. The basement of the mill was sealed. No door, no staircase, just stone, mortar black and bone pale, slabbed shut generations before. Even Corwin, the more cautious of the Whitaker brothers, refused to speak of what was beneath, but the ground remembered. It always does. In late autumn of 1862, the rats began to flee, not scurry, flee, in daylight, in droves, across the fields, up the trees, diving into wells as if anything was safer than the soil near the mill. Jonah Mears saw them one morning, dozens of them piled dead beneath his window, their bodies bent backwards, jaws snapped wide, as if screaming at something that shouldn't have opened. That week, Corwin broke. He walked into town square barefoot, his shirt torn, skin covered in ash, whispering scripture that didn't exist in any Bible. His mouth foamed, but not from madness. It reeked of flour and iron. When the townsfolk tried to restrain him, he looked skyward and shrieked, "It's not beneath, it's inside. The stone isn't dead." They chained him in the church cellar. He clawed at the floor until his nails were gone, and still Elias did not stop the mill. Instead, he began rebuilding it. He ordered iron from Philadelphia, stone from Rhode Island, strange ancient blocks with spiral carvings no quarryman could explain. He reinforced the wheel, deepened the shaft, and according to one surviving blacksmith, fed something down there with his own blood. It was no longer a factory, it was a temple, and the wheel, it didn't just grind anymore. It spoke. Not in words, not in sound, in dreams. Dozens of townspeople began hearing it. A rhythmic hum behind their thoughts, a voice in their teeth, a presence pacing behind their eyes. Pregnant women miscarried. Livestock drowned themselves. A child drew a map of the underground mill and hanged himself before anyone could ask how he'd seen it, and through it, the wheel turned. Relentless, eternal. Until the night Jonah returned to the mill, with fire. But what he found in the basement wasn't wood. It was flesh. Jonah Mears returned to the mill at midnight. He carried nothing but a lantern, a jug of kerosene, and a sharpened awl he'd stolen from his father's toolbox. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from memory, because something in him knew the layout of that mill, knew every step, every corner, every creak in the floorboards, like he'd walked it 1,000 times in dreams he could never fully remember. The main hall was silent. Machinery rusted over, but the wheel, silent above, still turned below. No water, no gears, just motion, steady, wet, and rhythmic, like lungs. Jonah descended where no stairs existed, because now there was a door. Where once there was only stone, a wooden hatch had appeared, its hinges slick with dark resin. Its handle pulsed when he touched it, not vibrated, pulsed. Like something beneath was waiting, listening. He opened it, and below him, not a basement, a cathedral, stone pillars slanted sideways like broken ribs. The air was thick with the smell of metal and rot. Roots ran along the walls, not tree roots but veined like muscle. The ceiling wept, the earth breathed, and at the center, the wheel. But it was no wheel. It was alive, a spiral of bone, tendon, and rusted steel, turning in silence. Soaked in something thicker than blood, every rotation left a groove in the ground, like it was boring into the world, deeper, deeper reaching, and strapped to it, bound with wire, was Corwin Whitaker, still breathing. His eyes were gone, but his mouth moved. Jonah stepped closer, and Corwin whispered, "You're the last name in the ledger, boy. Run." Jonah dropped the lantern, but the fire didn't spread. It sank, straight into the soil, sucked down like water into thirst, feeding something beneath the cathedral that should never have been woken. And as Jonah turned to flee, the wheel screamed, not in sound but in memory. Ever. By death. Every sacrifice, every name written and erased, echoed in his head all at once. That night, the mill didn't burn, it swallowed itself, and Jonah vanished. But in the morning, the town awoke to a new road, one that led down to the gorge, a road that had never been there before. By spring of 1863, the Whitaker mill no longer existed. Not even ash remained. Where once it stood, 3 stories tall, humming day and night, there was now a sunken patch of scorched earth, and a road that led to nowhere. A road that no one had built. A road lined with wild wheat that whistled in the wind. The townsfolk pretended it wasn't there, but they all felt it, especially at night. Some said they heard the mill wheel turning under the soil. Others claimed their dreams now ended at a wooden door in the ground, pulsing like a throat. And one woman, Mrs. Delphine Evermore, swore she gave birth to a child with sawdust in its mouth. The priest, Father Altham, tried to make sense of it. He organized vigils, burned relics, anointed the soil with holy water. But each night, his chapel bell rang on its own. He said the air near the gorge felt scripted, like it wanted you to act out a role, to step forward, to kneel. Then the ledger returned. It appeared in the church one Sunday morning, laid open on the altar, though no one saw who placed it there. Its pages were empty, but the cover was warm and stitched with a new name, Jonah Mears. Except Jonah was still missing, or so they thought. Until children started humming, same melody, always at dusk. 6 notes, minor key, over and over. And when asked where they'd learned it, they all gave the same answer. The boy in the ground taught us. That week, 3 more people vanished, always at night, always near the road to the gorge. No footprints, no blood, just a low hum left hanging in the air like breath in a winter church. Sheriff Harlan tried to destroy the ledger. He threw it in the river. It floated upstream. He buried it. The next morning, it was in his bed. He burned it, but that night his barn collapsed, and when he dug through the wreckage, he found the ledger unburned, open to a blank page, and written in his daughter's handwriting, "I'm still here, Daddy." Vermont newspapers never reported it. No headlines, no obituaries, no trace of the Whitaker disappearance ever made it to state records. But Washington knew. Because in May of 1863, a man from the War Department arrived in Marowak under false name and false orders. Clean boots, no accent. Government papers he never let out of sight. He called himself G. Harrow, said he was investigating draft resistance, but he never spoke to a single man of fighting age. Instead, he asked strange questions. Did the mill ever operate without water? Do you remember dreams with black staircases? Did anyone ever vanish and then come back different? He took soil samples from the gorge, measured electromagnetic fields, bought up every record of the Whitaker family and burned them in front of the town clerk, claiming national security. The clerk said Harrow muttered something under his breath as the pages turned to smoke. It's older than the war, older than names. By midsummer, Harrow had found the ledger. He shouldn't have, but he did, and unlike the others, he read it, every page. He didn't scream, didn't faint, he just whispered. They built the wheel for something they never understood. That night he disappeared from his boarding house. The room was untouched, window locked, door chained from inside, but the ledger was gone, and in its place, on the bedsheet, were drawn 7 circles, each one carved into the fabric with such force that the blade had gone straight into the mattress below. Each circle contained a single word: Whitaker, Jonah, Corwin, Elias, Marowak, Mill, Open. No one in town saw Harrow again. But 9 months later, the War Department closed all records related to unexplainable industrial phenomena in the Northeast. The files were sealed until 1962, and when they were unsealed, page 1 of the report was redacted. Page 2 was bloodstained. Page 3 simply read, "We were too late. The road was already dug." Her name was Eleanor Price. She was 17 the year the mill vanished. Just a girl then, with a limp in her step and a habit of listening when no one thought she was near. Her father, Abel Price, was the town gravedigger, and she often helped him in silence, sketching odd symbols in the dirt while he worked. Eleanor saw something she was never meant to see. The morning after Jonah Mears disappeared, she wandered near the gorge. The road was still forming, not paved, not carved, but grown. Grass parted like hair, soil peeled back on its own. She followed it barefoot and found the spot where the mill had stood. She said the ground there pulsed, like something breathing from underneath. She ran home, but that night she heard the voice. Not outside, from beneath her bed. It wasn't words at first, just a sound, wet, slow, like wood splintering in deep water. But then it said, "Bring the ledger back, Eleanor. You know where it is." She didn't, not yet. But in her dreams, the layout of the mill returned to her. The tunnels below, the spiral staircase that never ended, the stone walls covered in writing that moved like insects, and she saw a face, Jonah's, mouth stitched shut, eyes black with soot. He handed her the ledger, but in the dream, it was open to a page with her name, and something written below it. "You heard the wheel too." Eleanor woke screaming. The next morning, her father was dead, drowned in the grave he was digging, and by his body lay the ledger. But Eleanor didn't touch it. She buried it beneath his coffin, wrapped in cloth, salted, prayed over, marked with 7 nails and a ring of ash. And for years, it was quiet, until 1881, when a group of surveyors dug up the old cemetery to build a train line. They never found her father's body, just a book with no pages, and a message carved into the inside of the coffin lid. The wheel doesn't turn without names, and now it's hungry again. The names surfaced in New Orleans, 1883, on a police report involving a murder in the French Quarter. The victim was a historian, Professor Langston Avery, who'd been studying early mill towns of the Northeast. Not exactly a subject one gets killed over, but the state of his apartment told a darker tale. His tongue had been removed, his hands fused together with melted wax, and scrawled across every inch of his wallpaper, in charcoal, blood, and something that smelled like wet earth, was a single word, written hundreds of times. Whitaker. Detectives dismissed it as gibberish, but one officer, Emile Doucet, began digging, quietly. Methodically, he found that Avery had recently received a package from Vermont. No return address, just a box wrapped in butcher paper. Inside had been a millstone fragment and a torn page from a leather-bound book. The page was almost blank, except for the header, "The seventh son shall open the road," and at the bottom, a child's handwriting. "Don't listen to the whistling, Mr. Avery. It's not the wind." Officer Ducey followed the trail, Vermont, Merriwick, Whitaker, but when he arrived in the old town, he found it gone, not abandoned, not destroyed. Gone, as if it had been peeled off the map. Locals in nearby villages spoke of the hollow place, a stretch of woodland where compasses spun and crows flew in circles. No roads, no buildings, but some nights there were sounds. Grinding, thudding, and music, not from any instrument known, but like strings made of sinew, bowed by wind. Ducey stayed one night in the forest, only once. He emerged barefoot, covered in ash, eyes completely black though physically unharmed. He never spoke again, but in his final report, never filed officially, only discovered in a locked drawer decades later, he'd written something across an entire page in shaking ink. The mill never left, it just went deeper. And stapled to that page was a new photo, black and white, blurry, taken underground. It showed 7 boys in Whitaker clothes, staring directly at the camera. One was smiling, behind them etched into the stone wall, a circle of symbols, and in the center, a single phrase, "The Whitaker Sons return." By 1906, the whispers had reached Europe, not in newspapers, not in sermons, but in psychiatric hospitals. In Zurich, a child was institutionalized after drawing a spinning wheel across every wall of her home. Her parents claimed she hadn't spoken in weeks, only whistled, a long, low, unnatural tone. The doctors assumed possession or mania, but one man took interest. Carl Gustav Jung, the psychiatrist, visited the girl in secret. According to his unpublished notes, she repeated one word to him when shown a sketch of a watermill, Whitaker. Jung had never heard the name, but when he asked where she'd learned it, the girl tilted her head and replied, "He told me, the boy with the stitched mouth. He says the wheel still turns." The note stopped there, but 2 weeks later, Jung abandoned the case, and the girl was found dead in her cell, her body twisted unnaturally, her tongue turned to stone. Across the ocean, similar cases emerged. A farmer in Kansas who built a replica mill beneath his barn, with no blueprints, no explanation. A preacher in Alabama who began chanting in an unknown language during Sunday service, drawing millstones in ash around his pulpit. A child in Boston who wouldn't stop singing an old made-up rhyme. "Whitaker, Whitaker, turn the key. The seventh son will set us free. Open the door. Let the black wind spin. Let the whispers pull us in." By 1911, the pattern was undeniable. Wherever the name resurfaced, something followed. Deaths, disappearances, madness, silence, and always, the wheel. Not a real one, not mechanical, a conceptual mill buried in the collective unconscious, a shape that emerged again and again, in dreams, in art, in final words of the dying, a symbol of recursion, of hunger, of something ancient chewing time. One Harvard professor of folklore, Dr. Emery Vale, mapped the incidents. His final lecture ended with a single sentence whispered into the microphone: "The road isn't beneath the town is beneath the road." He was never seen again. Only his shoes were found, lined with ash and teeth. They called him Mr. Gable, not a name from the Whitaker family, not listed in any census, registry, or war record, but wherever a descendant of the original 7 Whitaker sons surfaced, he followed, and they always died screaming. The first was Samuel Whitaker III, a bookkeeper in Baltimore. His throat was found stuffed with sawdust and hair. Authorities ruled it suicide. Absurd, given the angle and force of the damage, but the room held no signs of forced entry, just one thing carved into the ceiling beam above his desk: "Sem Sons, one debt, paid in full." Then came Lyle Whitaker, a blind violinist in Chicago. He hadn't spoken since childhood, but the night before his death, neighbors reported hearing him chant, in a voice not his own, a pattern of numbers and syllables that matched ancient agricultural rites from pre-Christian Europe. He was found in his bathtub, smiling. Water dyed deep red with millstone dust. But the worst was Annabeth Whitaker, a 9-year-old orphan adopted by a Maine family. She was found asleep in the family barn, curled inside a circle of chalk symbols and broken corn husks. Above her, pinned to the rafters with hand-forged nails, was Mr. Gable, grinning, mummified, eyes open. No one could explain how he got there, or why his blood matched none of the DNA in U.S. archives, but in his coat pocket, a folded piece of parchment. One side had a drawing of a spinning wheel made of teeth. The other side held a list of names, all Whitakers, crossed out. One remained uncrossed. Isaiah Whitaker, B. 1862, Vermont. A name no one had ever heard. A man with no birth record, no grave, no death certificate. But 14 years later, in 1925, a photo would surface. At the edge of a collapsed silver mine in Colorado, rescue workers posed for a group shot. In the background, mostly in shadow, stood a man in a long coat. Tall, white beard, eyes blackened with soot. Identical to the 1862 daguerreotype of the original Whitaker patriarch, and on the back of the photo, someone had scrawled, "The wheel turns beneath the mountain now. Isaiah keeps it fed." Colorado, July 7, 1925. The Silver Vein incident began like any other mine collapse, until the survivors started drawing circles. 8 men had made it out alive, but in the days following their rescue, every one of them reported the same thing, not in public, but whispered in private, to wives, to priests, to anyone who would believe. We were not alone down there. They described tunnels that weren't on the blueprints, shafts that twisted in impossible geometry, spiraling down instead of across. They saw walls that breathed and shadows that whispered in English, backward. One man, Silas Dunn, clawed the word Whitaker into his own chest before hanging himself in the church bell tower. Another, Frank Malloy, built a miniature mill out of animal bones in his cellar. When police found him, he was mumbling a phrase over and over again. "The stone doesn't crush the grain, it remembers it." But it was Dr. Margot Hearn, a geologist, who blew the lid off. She studied the maps. The collapse didn't happen near any known fault line. No tremor, no water damage, no dynamite. But there was something else. A chamber. Not man-made, not natural. A cavity. 70 feet wide, lined with limestone worn into spiral grooves. "Grind marks," she said. And in the center of the chamber, a black altar, 6-sided. Burned into its top was a symbol seen nowhere in geology, but traced perfectly to medieval alchemical manuscripts describing wheels of transformation and mills of flesh. She went public. Then she vanished. 3 days after her radio interview, her house burned down. No survivors, only thing left untouched. A photo pinned to her corkboard. 7 young boys in 19th century clothing standing in the shadows of a mill. One of them was Isaiah Whitaker. The others all wore blindfolds, and carved into the wooden beam behind them, the Whitaker Sons were never born. They were harvested. The Whitaker files weren't lost. They were sealed. On October 2, 1933, a memo circulated through the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI. It was stamped top secret, addressed to only 3 people, and bore the title, Whitaker Sons, Mill Phenomenon, Containment Directives. The document, now declassified in fragments, contains one unforgettable phrase: "Do not attempt to interrupt the cycle. All intervention results in recursion or replication. Subject lineage must be observed, not broken." It wasn't written by a field agent. It was signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself. Which begs the question, why would the future director of the FBI, known for tracking real-world threats like organized crime and espionage, obsess over a 70-year-old rural legend about a haunted mill? Because something happened, something the public never saw. Between 1932 and 1933, 9 separate towns across the Northeast experienced mass memory blackouts. Entire communities awoke with no recollection of the previous 3 days, no storms, no alcohol, just gaps. In each town, one structure had been destroyed, a mill. And in every case, the ruins bore the same mark scorched into the stone, a perfect circle of 7 spokes, like a wheel turning inward. The government called it psychogenic dissociation, but witnesses disagreed. One elderly woman from Ipswich said, "We didn't forget, We gave the memory up. It was taken. Meanwhile, the Office of Naval Intelligence quietly launched Project Maelstrom, a classified operation aimed at locating descendants of Isaiah Whitaker. Their internal notes refer to the target group not as people, but as conductors. The files read, lineages must not intersect. Progeny tend to hear the wheel. Containment advised. Containment didn't mean prison. It meant placement. Descendants were funneled into government jobs, remote monasteries, asylums, anywhere isolated, monitored, and silent. One such man, Agent Thomas Varelli, broke protocol. In a taped interview, he said, "You don't understand. The mill isn't a place, it's a pressure. It finds its way in dreams, in habits, in names, and when it spins, you don't hear noise, you hear hunger." 2 weeks later, he vanished from a locked facility. Only thing left in his bed was a pile of flour and teeth. They kept him in a stone cell beneath the Basilica of San Clemente in Rome. No windows, no visitors, no speech. His name was Brother Caldero, a Spanish monk who took his final vow in 1895 and never spoke a single word again. But in 1944, during the Nazi occupation of Rome, he screamed. The sound, according to Vatican transcripts, was like metal grinding through a throat of ash. They thought he was possessed. 3 priests died trying to exorcise him. But he wasn't ranting, he was translating. A language older than Latin, one that matched glyphs etched into a black stone wheel uncovered in northern Vermont in 1862, the same year the Whitaker Sons were born. Brother Caldero's words were transcribed before he died, eyes rolled back, mouth leaking flour. Here's what he said: 7 spokes turn under blood, 1 leads, 6 bind. The wheel feeds on names, not flesh. Forgetting is a harvest, silence is a tithe. Speak the name, and it spins faster. The Vatican filed it under Codex Obscura 447a, labeled it heresy, and buried it in the Archivum Secretum, but not before one Jesuit archivist, Father André Moreau, made a copy. In 1951, he fled to America, to a monastery in rural Vermont, and contacted the Office of Naval Intelligence. His letter was intercepted. He was found 3 days later inside a millstone, not beneath it, inside it, as if the rock had grown around him. Inside his clenched hands, investigators found 2 things: a rusted key marked W and a note. Isaiah Whitaker didn't build the mill, he was built by it. There is growing evidence that the wheel is not a machine, not even a metaphor. It is a consciousness. It doesn't want worship. It wants structure, memory, ritual, obedience. It spins to organize the human soul. And when that structure breaks, when silence is broken or names are remembered, the cycle must begin again. And what fuels that cycle? The Whitaker Sons, born, bound, buried, reborn. 7 at a time, always 7. Every 77 years, and 1862 plus 77 equals 1939. So why did nothing happen then? Because it did. Germany, 1939. The world was bracing for war. But beneath the chaos, a hidden arm of the SS, the Ahnenerbe, was chasing something older than politics, older than bloodlines. They weren't after relics. They were after mechanisms. In Rothenburg, Obertauber, a town left untouched by bombing, there stood an abandoned 13th century synagogue. Its foundation was wrong, too deep, layered with stone not found anywhere in Germany. The Ahnenerbe sealed it off and sent in their specialists. What they found beneath the altar was not Jewish. It wasn't even human. A circular crypt, 22 feet wide, 7 iron niches cut into the walls, and at the center, a stone disc spinning without contact, humming so softly that it could only be felt in the teeth. The markings matched those found in Vermont, 1862, and a single word etched in both places, Whitaker. But how could that name, a colonial American surname, be carved into a stone buried before the Reformation? The Nazi archivists called it a dimensional echo, a reflection of something out of sequence. They brought in a child psychic from Prague, a girl named Eliska, to interface with the wheel. After touching it, she went still for 43 minutes. When she finally spoke, it was in perfect English. 7 boys. Their names are not names. They're instructions. The oldest never blinks. The middle eats bone. The youngest listens from under the floor. Then she smiled and said something no one understood, until years later when declassified CIA files revealed the name of the Vermont site. The mill doesn't grind, it tunes. Eliska died that night. Her skin turned gray, her fingertips split like parchment, and from her mouth came not screams, but the sound of grinding wheat. The SS sealed the crypt. They called the experiment a failure, but records show that the 7 niches in the wall were no longer empty. Inside each was a child's tooth, freshly extracted, American, not European. The implication was clear. The wheel wasn't in Germany, it was echoing. What's more, this confirmed a terrifying suspicion. The Whitaker Mill was not the first. It was one of many, a global system, a dark architecture hidden beneath the stories we tell ourselves about time, place, and identity. And every 77 years, it whispers again. His name was Gideon Whitaker, born in 1938 in Eagle Lake, Maine, population 272. His birth certificate was altered, his school records erased, his family vanished one by one, each relocated by federal intervention before he turned 7. He was placed in a state orphanage under the name G. White, with a note clipped to his file. Subject must remain within a 77-mile radius of origin point, monitor for recursive behavior, nocturnal fugue states, and linguistic anomalies. For years, Gideon was silent. Then, on March 3, 1956, he spoke a full sentence during a psychological assessment. "I am the third," spoke. The doctors didn't understand, but the man who overheard him, Dr. Carl Broven, a linguistic anthropologist working for the Office of Naval Intelligence, froze. Because that same phrase appeared in a Vatican archive he'd translated a decade earlier. And the rest of Gideon's statement? It wasn't English, it was the wheel's tongue. Over the next year, Gideon began to draw obsessively. Circles, spirals, mills, names. 7 names over and over. Thatcher, Ellison, Marin, Knox, Abram, Red, Gideon. Each name paired with a symbol, not letters, but functions, commands. When Broven finally cracked the code, it wasn't a family tree. It was a blueprint. Each name activated a piece of the machine. Thatcher, initiate; Ellison, conceal; Marin, feed; Knox, bind; Abram, turn; Red, forget; Gideon, remember. One of them always wakes up. One of them always remembers. By 1962, the 100th anniversary of the original Whitaker birth year, Gideon had vanished. No records, no sightings. Until July 1970, when a body matching his description was found just outside Essex Junction, Vermont. In the ruins of an old grist mill, a circle of ash surrounded him. On his chest was carved a phrase, "It turns because we obey, it obeys because we forget." But here's the part. But no one explains. His heart was missing, and inside his ribcage, nestled between bone and dust, they found a single gear, made of teeth. He was known only as Brother Osric. The monastery claimed he arrived in 1883, barefoot and mute, left at their stone gate with a millstone strapped to his back. They assumed he was a penitent, but he never prayed. He measured every corridor, every stair, even the flickering pattern of candlelight on the chapel floor. He was obsessed with ratios, 7:1, 1177, 308 to the square. But when asked, he never explained, until the spring of 1963. Brother Osric hadn't spoken in 80 years. Then, after collapsing in the abbey orchard, he whispered a name to the priest tending him, Velkareth. The priest thought it was gibberish, until the word showed up days later, carved into a slab of wet limestone inside the Whitaker Mill ruins, hundreds of miles away. Osric lived 3 more days. In those final hours, he spoke constantly, and scholars, linguists, even military codebreakers were summoned to transcribe it. What they found was a pattern not of theology, but of calibration. The wheel was not built by man. It is older than clay. It came through the crack in the memory of language. We are its ratios, its symmetry, its fuel. He claimed there are 3 kinds of humans: the bound, those who labor in forgetfulness; the tuned, those who awaken, if only for moments. The spokes, born marked, born to initiate each cycle. 7 spokes every 77 years, and one name passed through them, in blood, in sleep, in silence. That name? Velkareth. According to Osric, it isn't just the name of the wheel, it's the name of a sentient architecture, a consciousness that exists across time like a mill grinds across generations. Each child, each sacrifice, each whispered name is not worship, it's maintenance. The wheel doesn't need believers, it needs structure, and when memory breaks, when names are spoken aloud, the entire system reorganizes violently. Before his death, Brother Osric gave one last instruction: do not bury me near stone. I turn in my sleep. They cremated him, but the next morning his ashes had arranged themselves, 7 circles, one inside the other. At the center, a single tooth, filed flat, carved with a symbol, a key. The Whitaker mill was officially demolished in 1944, or so the papers said, but the foundation remained, sunk into the Vermont clay like a wound that never scarred. Locals avoided it, birds never landed, and every year, 1 week before the first frost, names would appear on the moss-covered stones, burned in, not carved. Always 7, always the same: Thatcher, Ellison, Marin, Knox, Abram, Red, Gideon. For decades it was folklore, a rural ghost story whispered by loggers and bored high schoolers, that is, until July 18, 2025. A construction drone surveying a future subdivision site passed over the ruins and caught something impossible: a child, no more than 10, standing alone at the center of the stone circle, wearing 19th century clothing, no shoes, no shadow. When the drone lowered altitude, the audio sensors picked up a voice, but not the child's. It was 7 voices, speaking in unison, and each was repeating a different name. A linguist hired to analyze the clip noted a glitch in the waveform. The names didn't overlay, they wove together like chords in a scale, a harmonic structure, not random. When slowed down to 1/77th speed, the audio produced a single, intelligible phrase: "We never died, we were translated." The child's face is the most disturbing part. He matches, exactly, the facial structure of Gideon Whitaker, last seen in 1962. Same cheekbones, same scar above the eye. But Gideon was born in 1938. This child is no older than 10. And then, before the drone feed cuts out, the child smiles. Not a human smile, a knowing one, because he's not looking at the camera. He's looking through it, as if he's remembering a future already lived. Later that week, 7 children from nearby towns went missing, each one born 77 years apart from the original Whitaker Sons. No witnesses, no evidence, but every mother reported the same: a dream the night before, a stone wheel, spinning, grinding grain made of bone, and a voice whispering from beneath the floorboards: "We turn because the world must forget." But someone hasn't forgotten, and they're coming back to the mill, not to destroy it, to reactivate it. Long before Vermont, before the Whitakers, before the word mill was even spoken in English, there was the first turning. BC. In what is now northern Anatolia, a temple was discovered buried beneath 7 layers of ash and limestone, a place known only by a glyph: Heltar, that which grinds itself. Archaeologists in the 1920s called it the Anatolian Gear Temple. They unearthed a chamber filled with circular tracks, not meant for worship, but for rotation. In the center, a massive stone disc etched with sigils matching those found in Vermont's Whitaker Mill. Despite a 2,500-year and 5,000-mile gap, that same pattern appeared on a burial wheel in Sumer, 1798 BC, a funerary sundial in Egypt, 1260 BC, a bone crank altar in Gaul, 1st century AD, and a blackened gear in a Crusader ossuary under Jerusalem, 1144 AD. Each artifact dated to the final year of its civilization's ascendancy, then collapse. Exactly 539 years from the first turning. But here's what no one tells you. All these cultures left behind the same phrase, translated across dozens of ancient tongues. We built it to end forgetting. It made forgetting holy. The Anatolian structure, it wasn't a mill. It was a mimetic containment system. The wheel was built to process human memory, to grind unbearable knowledge into silence. Each generation sacrificed their wisest, their eldest, their marked, feeding them to the turning. And in return, peace, obedience, forgetfulness. But when the system overloaded, when too many remembered, it didn't collapse, it awakened. An ancient Roman scroll buried beneath Hadrian's wall tells of a machina ex memoria, the machine from memory, that emerges every 5 centuries to consume the minds of the living and rewrite history's root sequence. That time is now, because 539 years ago from 2025, it was 1486, the year Heinrich Kai Raymer wrote Malleus Maleficarum, the manual that ignited Europe's witch hunts. The year memory became heresy, and the year a secret shipment of stone gears was smuggled from Anatolia to the New World, hidden in the foundation of a colonial mill in a place that would one day be called Vermont. Her name is Claire Adeline Whitaker, age 34. Profession, behavioral memory specialist at the Vermont Institute of Neurolinguistic Studies. Unmarried, no children. Last living descendant of the Whitaker bloodline, or so she believed. Claire spent her adult life trying to forget. The screams in the attic, the floorboards that hummed at night, the voices her father called echoes of the past returning to feed. She told herself they were dreams. Until the letter arrived, unmarked, no return address, just a single sheet of vellum paper folded twice, on it, drawn in blood, the 7-spoke wheel, and below it, the phrase, "One key remains, turning behind your eyes." She ran biometric scans, nothing, DNA sequencing, standard. But a month later, her neural rhythm data began showing patterns, repeating loops, 7-second cycles. Every night at 3:03 a.m., Claire would enter a fugue state, rising from bed and standing barefoot in her hallway for precisely 539 seconds, whispering the same word, Marin. When she finally allowed her dreams to continue, uninterrupted by pills or scans, she saw it, the original mill, alive again, the gears grinding not grain, but language, books poured into hoppers, sermons pressed into pulp, memories sliced into powder and fed into the furnace below. She stood at the top of the turning, and all around her were children, wearing 19th century rags, eyes closed, mouths sewn shut. But Claire, her mouth was open. She was speaking, not English, not Latin, but the same tongue etched on the Anatolian gears, on the Crusader relic, and in Gideon's final drawing, the wheel remembers itself. Then she woke up, covered in ash, 7 names scratched into her skin with fingernails she had no memory of growing. Thatcher, Ellison, Marin, Knox, Abram, Red, and hers, Claire. Because the 7th name is always the one who remembers, and see, Lair. She just booked a one-way trip to Essex Junction, back to the ruins of the Whitaker Mill, back to the place where the first forgetting began, but she's not going alone. Something inside her is waking up, and it's hungry. The Whitaker Mill ruins weren't listed on any modern map, but Claire found it anyway. Hidden behind a state-run wildlife corridor, fenced in with rusted iron inscribed in Latin, Memoris est dolor. To remember is pain. She didn't bring tools, didn't need to. The land itself seemed to part for her, as if it knew she was coming home. At the heart of the overgrown clearing stood the mill's foundation, a stone ring blackened by time, vines, and something far older. Claire stepped inside, and the world went silent. No wind, no birds, not even the hum of her own breath. She knelt and placed her palm on the stone. It was warm. Then, without warning, the center cracked open, not like rock breaking, but like a sealed mouth opening, revealing a spiraling shaft descending deeper than any structure had a right to. Claire didn't hesitate. She climbed down, rung by rung, into a tunnel lined not with dirt, but with bone. Each vertebra fused into the next, like the spinal column of some enormous creature. And every few feet, a human tooth embedded in the wall, each one etched with a letter. The letters weren't random. They formed a language, one Claire had never studied, yet understood perfectly. We turned the world turned us back. We fed it memory, now it feeds on the lack. At the tunnel's base, she found the core. Not a machine, not alive, something in between, a mass of teeth, hair, fingernails, and scripture, fused together into a pulsing wheel. It wasn't turning, it was breathing. Claire touched it, and the visions came. Gideon, aged 9, lowering a bloodied hand into the first gear. A priest sealing 7 children into a revolving room beneath a false chapel. A woman in 1547 London giving birth in chains while chanting a forgotten dialect of Latin. A monk in 1004 gouging his eyes out with a bone stylus after seeing the inner mechanism of God. All of them part of the same cycle. All of them Whitakers. And Claire saw her place in it. The final loop. The 7th turn. The last key. But what she didn't see, what she didn't expect, was the eye. It opened in the center of the core, not human, not animal, but hers. Looking up at her, and it whispered in her own voice, "It is time to grind the silence into sound." The core began to turn. Claire didn't resist. She opened her mouth and began to sing. They called it the Vermont tremor. Seismographs read it as a minor quake, 3.1 magnitude, localized entirely to Essex Junction, but no tectonic shift could explain what happened that night. At 3:03 a.m., every weather vane in the region spun counterclockwise. Church bells rang with no one pulling their ropes. Farm dogs howled, then fell silent, ears pressed to the ground. And in the Whitaker ruins, Claire sang. Her voice wasn't human anymore. It wasn't even language. It was pattern, frequencies older than speech. The exact tonal inversions used in the Malleus Harmonia, the forbidden musical codex burned by the Vatican in 1473. And as she sang, the core responded. The wheel turned, grinding not matter but time. The past unspooled like thread. Ghosts blinked into existence. Children with blank eyes wandered from the woods. Figures in 19th century clothing appeared in the town square, confused, bleeding, some whispering Claire's name. Across the country, others heard it. Men in their sleep muttered unknown prayers. A woman in Kansas woke screaming, "The 7th turn is complete." An infant in Maine began reciting Latin backwards, and deep in a locked facility in Langley, Virginia, alarms triggered. The words Whitaker Anomaly, Phase 7 blinked on a secured screen because the mills weren't just structures, they were geometric suppressors, built to grind human consciousness into manageable fragments. But now, one of them had been reversed. Claire had awakened the wheel, and it was no longer content with turning in secret. She stepped from the shaft at dawn, barefoot and trembling, her mouth bleeding from overuse. Behind her, the mill ruins had vanished. In their place, a perfect spiral burned into the ground. 7 rings, 1 eye, and on the wind a new sound. Not birds, not wind, but chanting. Thousands of voices waking across the ear. Those whose ancestors had been marked, those whose memories were never truly their own. The sons and daughters of the wheel. Claire had broken the seal, and now the world would remember what it had been built to forget. The mills were never for grain, they were for containment, and now the turning has begun again.